So that's been always throughout history a major reason why you have had creation of money to finance government expenditures. But we've added another reason in these days, and that's allegedly to promote full employment. In the post-war world, after World War II, every country in the West has had a full employment policy, which means not that we've had full employment. On the contrary, as you know, we've been having increasing unemployment in recent years. But that every time, for quite a period, there was a threat of unemployment or unemployment started to rise. There was a strong tendency by government to say, we've got to do something about this. We have to print more money. We have to spend more money. We have to stimulate the economy. The result of which has been to create an increased quantity of money that in the first instance has had some favorable effects on employment, but only temporarily, only so long as you could fool the people. And then, when people got on to what was going on, it came out in the form of inflation. In the United States, we've also had, and in most countries, a third, less important factor that has contributed to excessive increases in the quantity of money. And that has been mistaken policies by the central bank. Professor Segan referred to the mistake of the Federal Reserve Bank in the late 20s, early 30s. From 1929 to 1933, the quantity of money in the United States went down by a third. And that was a major factor that produced the catastrophe. That was a great mistake of the Federal Reserve. It learned from that mistake. Government agencies, like people, don't always make the same mistake the next time. They make a different one. And since that period, the central banks have tended to make the mistake in the opposite direction. Their mistake has almost always been caused by confusing their function, by thinking that they had something to do with interest rates, instead of recognizing that their real function was to control the quantity of money. Now, most of you will be inclined to say, well, that's all very well, but aren't there some important things you've left out? Of course, the most obvious thing you would have told me I left out was trade union behavior. But I hope I've already persuaded you that that's not a fundamental source of inflation. Trade unions may do a great deal of harm in a great many ways. Trade unions have done Britain enormous harm, but they are not responsible for Britain's inflation. Higher wages are in the main a consequence of inflation and not a cause of it. And as I say, the examples of these charts I gave you before, I hope, will show that anybody who thinks that's a fundamental cause of inflation had better pause for a bit. But there are two other factors that people are inclined to cite. One is to say, what about international influences? The government is particularly fond of citing this, to say, oh, well, you mustn't blame us for inflation. We've imported it from abroad. There's a worldwide inflation, and how can you expect the United States to stay clear of inflation if all the rest of the countries of the world are inflating? Now, that was a valid explanation before 1971, when we had a worldwide system of fixed exchange rates. In that case, it is true that inflation in one country would tend to spill over into another because it would influence the quantity of money. In that case, it was inflation in America that produced in the United States that produced inflation in many countries around the world, because their currencies were linked through a fixed exchange rate with ours. But today, that explanation is not valid. As long as countries have variable, floating, flexible exchange rates between their currencies, inflation is a national phenomenon and not an international phenomenon. And the proof of that is very simple. If inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's not an international phenomenon. You know, in every country of the world you have too high taxes, but high taxation is not an international phenomenon. It's just that all the nations of the world do it at the same time. In the same way, you have inflation in many countries. But if it were an international phenomenon, how come it's roughly 0 to 1% in Switzerland, 4 to 5 or 6% in Germany, 10% in France, 18% in Great Britain, maybe higher than that in Italy, and so on down the line? No, inflation is a national phenomenon produced by monetary policy and other policies within the countries. Now, the second argument that will be made, you've left out of this picture productivity. In those charts, what was it that I connected with prices? It was not simply the quantity of money. It was the quantity of money per unit of output. And it's true. Anything that increases output will tend to hold down prices. And so it's very common for people to say, well, the real source of inflation is that our productivity has not been increasing as much as it should. Or to say that the real cure for inflation is to increase productivity. Now, productivity is an enormously important phenomenon. From the point of view of our standard of life, of how well we live, there's nothing that's more important. If we can get a rate of real growth of 3% instead of 2%, that will make a great difference over a period of time. And I don't doubt that one of our national problems is a fall off in the growth and productivity. But from the point of view of inflation, it's the wrong order of magnitude. It would be a tremendous achievement to raise the average rate of growth of real output in this country from 3% a year to 4% a year. That would be a 33 1/3% increase. It would be a dramatic change. But it would reduce the rate of inflation by 1 percentage point a year. And from that point of view, the possible variations in the quantity of money are much greater than the variations in output and productivity. So from the point of view of inflation, productivity is very much of a bit actor on the stage. The lead, the hero or the villain, as you wish it, is not productivity, but what happens to the quantity of money.